Hi, my name is Brittany J. Jones. In this video, I will be showing you how to set in sleeves. Setting in sleeves can be a little intimidating, but I'm going to share some tips that I do every time that I set in sleeves that makes it go in a lot easier. Number one, you cannot skip out on the basic stitches. If you try to set in a sleeve without doing your 2 rows of gathering ease stitches, it will be really hard to get your sleeve in nice and clean. So number one is to not skip out on basting. Number two is to use a lot of pins, and I mean a lot. Using a lot of pins is really going to help you be able to distribute the gathers and make sure everything is smoothly while you are sewing. So make sure that you use a lot of pins when you are setting in sleeves. Tip number 3 is to make sure that when you're stitching, you have your ease stitches facing up to you. That way, if you need to move any or distribute a little bit more while you're sewing, you'll be able to see it to help prevent any folds on the right side of the fabric. I'm excited to set in a sleeve, so let's get started. The first thing that we want to do is make sure that we transfer all of the markings on our pattern. You can see here that I've gone ahead and transferred my dots onto my fabric. To transfer dots, you can take a pin. You can put the pin through the circle that corresponds to the size that you have cut. So this pattern piece is cut for the size 16, so I'm just going to put it through there. Using your favorite marking tool, you will then pull back the pattern piece and just transfer the dot around the pin. You will also go ahead and do that for the other piece of fabric, transferring it to the wrong side. You can then remove your pin, and then you have all your markings transferred. I also like to place a tiny snip right at the top circle as well. I feel like that just helps me to line it up with my shoulder seam even better. And now we can go ahead and do 2 rows of gathering ease stitches right here between the dots. So we're going to start at this dot and work our way all the way around to this dot. To do a gathering ease stitch, we're going to need a basting stitch. If you don't know what a basting stitch is, please refer to your machine manual. The basting stitch is the longest stitch length on your machine. So refer to your manual just to see how to make that adjustment so that you can lengthen out your stitch, because again, we do need to use a basting stitch. Let's go ahead and apply the 2 rows of gathering ease stitches now. I'm not going to do my gathering stitches directly on my seam line, which is going to be a 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to come over a little bit more into the seam allowance at about 1/2 of an inch, and then I'll do my second basting stitch at 1/4 of an inch. I don't like to do it directly on the seam line just because once we put our permanent stitch in, when we go to pull out the gathers, I don't want them getting tangled in my permanent stitch. So again, I'm going to start my first row of basting stitches 1/2 inch from the raw edge down, and then I come back from the raw edge and go down 1/4 of an inch for my second row. Now that we have our 2 rows of gathering ease stitches added on to our sleeve, now we need to go ahead and stitch the side seam of our sleeve in place. So with the right sides facing, I'm going to go ahead and fold my sleeve here so that I can stitch the side seams. So go ahead and grab some pins and pin your side seam together. Again, this should be right sides facing. If you have a notch, you want to make sure that you pin at your notch first. Once you have your sleeve pinned, we can go to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, or according to your directions in your sewing instructions. You want to make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and at the end, and make sure that you change your stitch length back to a regular machine stitch, since we did just do basting stitches. Once you have your sleeve seam sewn and you have pressed it flat, you can also go ahead and finish off your raw edges. Whether you use pinking shears or a serger, that's your personal choice and preference. But once you have this step done, now we can go ahead and grab our bodice and start to pin in our sleeve. To install your sleeve, you want to go ahead and turn your sleeve pattern piece right side out. Next, we want to take a look at our notches, because this is how we will know if we are installing the right sleeve into the right armhole. The double notches will go to the back and the single notch will go to the front. So if I was to match up my center seam here with right sides facing and got ready to pin, I will see that I have a double notch here and a single notch. So this is not the correct armhole. taking our underarm sleeve seam, we're going to match it up to our side seam of the bodice. And you want to pin there first. We want to make sure that we have these seams even. And a trick to do that is to use a pin. You can push the pin right through the seam and then make sure that it goes through the other seam. This is very similar to pinning together dart legs. You want to make sure that it's going through both of the seams, and then you can go ahead and pin it in place. Now I'm going to flip over my bodice so that I can pin my sleeve completely in. Before we start to pull up our gathers, we want to secure one end of them in place. So I'm going to grab a pin. I'm going to place it in here right beside the gathers where we started, and I'm going to do a figure 8. I just want to secure these so when I pull the threads on the other side, I don't pull my gathers completely out. And I have all 4 threads in my hand. I'm just going to go around the pin in a figure 8, and again, I'm just securing them, holding the threads in place. After we have that secured, now we need to match up our notches and pin there. We can also pin between the notches down here. And put one more pin here. Now when you take a look at your armhole and your sleeve cap, you can see that the cap is bigger, so we need to ease in this fullness so that it fits nice and smooth right here into the armhole. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pull up on my bobbin stitches here, and my bobbin is in the red thread. I'm going to pull up on these stitches here, and you'll see the fabric will begin to slightly gather. Now, this isn't like a gathering skirt where we need and want the gathers to show. We don't want that unless it is a design element, and that is what you see in the finished garment and also in the line drawings. But we just want to ease in some of this fullness so that the sleeve cap can go into the armhole smoothly. Okay, I've done just a little bit of easing, so now I'm going to start pinning my markings. I transferred all of my circles even onto my bodice, so I'm going to match those up, pin there, and now I can pin right here as well. I'm going to come to the other side and find that circle, and I'm going to pin here and also here. And now you can see that I've eased in just enough that it fits into this armhole now, and so we can continue pinning. Now your shoulder seam matches up to that notch that was at the center. Go ahead and line that up, and I also placed a snip there. Again, it just makes it a little bit easier to match up. And I can distribute a little bit more of my ease stitches to this side here, like so. And I'm going to place a pin, and I do recommend using a lot of pins. So now that we have our sleeve pinned, we want to go ahead and baste it in place first. It's important to baste it in place first because that gives us the opportunity to check on the right side of our garment to make sure that there are no puckers or folds or anything. We want it to be nice and smooth. So when you baste it in place first and you check, it gives you that opportunity to make sure that everything looks good, and also to make adjustments before you put in a permanent stitch. So let's go to the sewing machine now, and we're going to baste it in place. When basting and sewing your sleeve in place, make sure that you have your ease stitches facing up. It's better to be able to see them. That way you can make sure that you're sewing them in nice and flat. All right, I have my sleeve basted in place. It's a lot of threads happening right now, but again, we basted it in place so that we'll be able to turn it on the right side. and just take a look at it to make sure that everything is installed and it's nice and clean. And I'm really happy with it. I don't see any folds, any puckers. Everything looks nice and smooth. Let's check out the underarm. We matched up our seam nicely. If you are happy with your stitch, now you can go back to the sewing machine and we're just going to stitch right along our seam line at a 5/8 of an inch, and we're going to use a regular machine length. So make sure that you put your stitch length back on a 2.5. After we have our permanent stitch in, then we're going to do another stitch 1/4 of an inch into the seam line, and that's just going to give us a double stitch here. I will say, if you have a serger, this would be a fantastic time that after you have sewn your permanent stitch here, you can just use the second stitch as your serger stitch, and that will not only trim away the excess fabric, but it will finish off your sleeve nicely. All right, I have just sewn both of my permanent stitches. So I sewed the first one here on a 5/8 of an inch right along our basting stitch, and then I removed the basting stitch. If it does get tangled, you can use a seam ripper to just kind of pull the basting stitch out of your regular stitch. And then I went over 1/8 of an inch inside the seam allowance from our first permanent stitch along our seam line. I went over 1/8 of an inch and I did another stitch. Again, if you have a serger and if you prefer to just use your serger as your second stitch to finish off the raw edge, you can go ahead and do that instead of doing the second row of stitching here. Next, I'm going to go ahead and remove the first 2 rows of basting stitches here, and I can see that my stitches did get a little tangled, so I'm going to use my seam ripper here to kind of wiggle them out. Now we can go ahead and trim close to our second stitch here, the one that we did 1/8 of an inch away. You can trim close to that stitch. And once you have trimmed it down close to your second stitching, we have one more step to do. The last step is to go ahead and steam your seam. Now we want to steam it as opposed to pressing it because we don't want to press in any wrinkles. So if you have a pressing ham here, this is the perfect time to pull it out, and here is why. Because we have this curve here, we can just put our sleeve right over and just steam it. So I have my iron here and I'm just going to steam my seam. I just finished steaming my seam here, and as you can see, I did not press in any wrinkles or any folds. Everything is in nice and smooth. So once you are done steaming, you have just set in a sleeve, and you're going to do those same steps to do your other sleeve here.